May 28, 1940, London. Late afternoon light filtered through the curtained windows of 10 Downing Street, but inside the cabinet room there was no warmth. Britain stood alone, and everyone in the room understood it. Across the Channel, France was collapsing. German armored columns had reached the sea at Abbeville. The British Expeditionary Force, nearly 340,000 men, was trapped against the coast at Dunkirk. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. An invasion of Britain was no longer theoretical, it was expected. At the head of the table sat Winston Churchill, Prime Minister for just 18 days. His appointment had been an act of desperation, not consensus. He was 65, controversial, and mistrusted by many of his own colleagues. And now, with the nation facing possible annihilation, some of those colleagues were ready to cut their losses. The question before the War Cabinet was stark. Should Britain explore negotiations with Adolf Hitler, using Benito Mussolini as an intermediary? Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, spoke calmly, deliberately. Britain, he argued, must be realistic. If acceptable terms could preserve the empire and spare the country from invasion, it would be reckless not to listen. Others around the table, Neville Chamberlain among them, did not object. Silence carried its own meaning. Churchill listened. He smoked. He said little at first. Outside the room, air raid sirens wailed intermittently. Inside, the empire's future hung on words not yet spoken. Churchill knew what negotiations meant. He had seen the agreements Hitler signed and broke. He had warned about German ambitions for a decade while others dismissed him as an alarmist. Now those warnings had come due, and Britain was nearly alone in paying the price. If Britain sued for peace now, before a single German soldier set foot on English soil, the war would be over. The Royal Navy would survive, perhaps. The empire might linger, but Britain would no longer decide its own fate. This meeting, held before any invasion fleet had sailed, before any surrender demand had been issued, was the true moment of decision. And Churchill understood something his colleagues did not yet fully accept. Once this step was taken, it could not be undone. The pressure that filled the cabinet room on May 28th had been building for weeks, long before Churchill took his seat at the head of the table. In September 1939, Britain went to war not out of confidence, but out of obligation. Poland had fallen in days. Norway followed. By the spring of 1940, German forces had smashed through the Ardennes. Terrain French planners had declared impassable and shattered the Allied front. The French high command collapsed almost as quickly as its armies. Paris would fall within weeks. Britain's position had been misjudged for years. Its army was small. Its air defenses are incomplete. Its population is unprepared for sustained bombing. The Royal Navy remained formidable, but naval power could not stop a mechanized army once it crossed the Channel. Churchill had been called to office on May 10th, the very day German forces invaded France and the Low Countries. He inherited a war already lost on the continent. The responsibility was total, but his authority was not. The Conservative Party remained divided. Halifax, not Churchill, had been the preferred candidate of many senior figures, including King George VI. Halifax embodied a different tradition of leadership. Measured, aristocratic, cautious. He believed Britain's primary duty was survival, not defiance. In private memoranda, he argued that Britain must avoid being ground down in a war it could not win alone. Negotiation, he insisted, was not surrender, it was prudence. Churchill rejected that language entirely. To him, negotiation with Hitler was not a diplomatic act, but a moral collapse. He believed that any peace offered would be conditional, humiliating, and temporary. Germany would dictate terms. Britain would obey. And resistance, once abandoned, would never be recovered. Still, Churchill could not dictate policy alone. The War Cabinet was small, just 5 men, but evenly divided. Churchill and Clement Attlee opposed talks. Halifax pressed for them. Chamberlain wavered, his authority diminished, but his influence intact. What made the moment dangerous was not panic, but reason. No German troops had landed in Britain. No ultimatum had been issued.
Negotiations, if pursued now, could be framed as voluntary, even dignified. The enemy had not yet demanded surrender. Britain could choose the timing, the language, and the intermediary. That was precisely what alarmed Churchill. In his private notes, he wrote that entering discussions would be like throwing away our sword before the fight begins. Once talks were opened, pressure would mount to conclude them. Each concession would make resistance harder to resume. Each delay would weaken morale at home and credibility abroad. He also understood the larger calculation. If Britain held out, even alone, the war remained global. If Britain quit, the war would become continental, and Hitler would reign unchallenged from the Atlantic to the Urals. The United States watched closely. So did the Dominions. So did occupied Europe. Britain's decision would signal whether resistance was still possible or already finished. As Halifax continued to argue for exploration of terms, Churchill realized that logic alone would not suffice. He would have to confront fear directly. Not Hitler's fear, Britain's. And he would have to do it before the idea of negotiation took root.
The debate did not end with that meeting. It hardened. On May 28 and 29, 1940, the War Cabinet reconvened repeatedly, sometimes twice in a single day. Each session returned to the same question, phrased in different ways but leading to the same precipice. Should Britain authorize contact with Mussolini to discover what terms Hitler might offer? Halifax pressed his case with increasing urgency. He argued that Britain's position would only deteriorate. The evacuation at Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, had begun, but its success was far from assured. At best, a fraction of the trapped force might escape. At worst, the core of Britain's professional army would be destroyed or captured. Halifax warned that waiting would mean negotiating later from a position of humiliation rather than initiative. He spoke of saving lives, of preserving independence in name if not in full freedom. He insisted that refusing to listen was reckless pride. Churchill replied with restraint, but his anger was visible. He spoke of treaties broken, of Poland abandoned, of Czechoslovakia erased. He reminded the cabinet that Mussolini was not a neutral broker, but Hitler's ally. Any terms offered would be designed to fracture Britain's alliances and bind it permanently to German dominance. Still, Halifax did not yield. At one point, he suggested that even if Britain lost its fleet or colonial possessions, survival of the homeland might justify the cost. Chamberlain listened carefully. The balance was uncertain. Churchill recognized the danger. He knew that a formal vote in the War Cabinet could be lost. Worse, even a narrow victory would leave the government divided and paralyzed. He needed to change the terms of the argument itself. On the afternoon of May 28th, Churchill took an unusual step. He summoned the full cabinet, 25 ministers, many excluded from war decisions, into the cabinet room. These were men responsible for domestic policy, labor, finance, and transport. They were not privy to daily military briefings, but they represented the broader government and, more importantly, the nation's political will. When they gathered, Churchill spoke without notes. He described Britain's position without illusion. France was falling. The army was in peril. Air raids would come. Invasion might follow. There were no guarantees of survival. Then he spoke of negotiation. If Britain approached Hitler now, he said, it would not receive peace but submission. The empire would be dismantled piece by piece. The government would exist at the German pleasure. Resistance would be impossible. He paused, then he delivered the line that mattered. If this Long Island story of ours is to end, he said, let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. There was no applause, but there was no dissent. One by one, ministers spoke, not with bravado, but with resolve. They did not claim victory was certain. They claimed only that surrender was unacceptable. The mood of the room shifted decisively. When Churchill returned to the War Cabinet later that day, the dynamic had changed. Halifax found himself isolated, not by argument, but by consensus. The government as a whole would not support negotiation. The moment for indecision had passed. The question was no longer whether Britain could survive the war, it was whether it would choose to fight it at all. The final confrontation came on the morning of May 29, 1940. The War Cabinet assembled again, aware that the window for action was closing. German forces were tightening the perimeter around Dunkirk. Every hour lost meant more men captured, more leverage surrendered. If negotiations were to begin, they had to begin now. Halifax made one last attempt. He did not ask for surrender. He asked only for permission to inquire, quietly, discreetly, what terms might be available. Knowledge, he argued, was not commitment. Britain could still reject any offer it found unacceptable. Churchill understood the trap. Once the inquiry was made, Britain would be perceived as seeking peace. Word would leak, if not in London, then in Rome or Berlin. Morale at home would falter. Allies and potential allies would assume Britain's resistance was temporary. The act of asking would change everything. He replied firmly. There would be no inquiry, no approach, no intermediary. Britain would fight on. He spoke not as a tactician, but as a man who believed he was speaking for history itself. He said Britain's strength lay not in immediate prospects, but in refusal. Refusal to accept a world ordered by force. Refusal to trade honor for time. Refusal to survive as something lesser than itself. Chamberlain, after a long silence, aligned with Churchill. The decision was made without a formal vote. It did not need one. Halifax recognized the shift and withdrew his proposal. The matter was closed. This was the irreversible choice. Britain would not negotiate before invasion. It would not negotiate after the invasion. It would not negotiate at all. Within days, Churchill would deliver speeches that echoed this resolve to the nation, promising blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and vowing to fight on the beaches. But those words were consequences, not causes. The real decision had already been taken, in private, among a handful of men, before the enemy arrived. The cost of that decision was immediately apparent. If Dunkirk failed, Britain would face invasion with a shattered army. If the Royal Air Force lost the coming air battle, the Channel would become a highway for German landing craft. Cities would burn. Civilians would die in the thousands. Churchill accepted this fully. In his private correspondence, he admitted that defeat was possible. He did not promise survival. He promised resistance. What made the moment extraordinary was not confidence, but clarity. Churchill did not believe Britain was destined to win. He believed it must choose not to yield, even if the outcome was destruction. By closing the door to negotiation, he removed all safety nets. There would be no partial peace, no conditional survival, no retreat behind diplomatic language. Only war, in its total form. From that moment forward, Britain's fate would be decided not by compromise, but by endurance. And endurance, once chosen, demands everything. The consequences of that decision became visible almost immediately. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, the evacuation at Dunkirk defied expectation. Against every forecast, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers were pulled from the beaches and harbor, an army rescued not by strategy alone, but by will. Civilian boats crossed under fire, destroyers burned. The army survived, though its weapons did not. Britain had men, but little else. France surrendered on June 22. Britain stood alone. Inside the government, the balance of power had shifted permanently. Halifax would remain foreign secretary, but the question of negotiation never returned. The cabinet understood now that Churchill's authority came not from unanimity, but from resolve. He had staked everything on refusal and survived the first test. Abroad, the signal was unmistakable. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt took note. Britain's refusal to seek peace suggested the war was not yet decided. Lend-Lease would follow. In the occupied capitals of Europe, underground movements began to listen more closely to British broadcasts. Resistance, however distant, was still conceivable. In Berlin, the reaction was disbelief. Hitler had assumed Britain would negotiate once France fell. He had expected rational calculation to prevail over defiance. When it did not, he delayed invasion plans and turned eastward, making a decision that would ultimately destroy his empire. None of this was visible in May 1940. What was visible was a nation bracing for impact. Air raid shelters were filled. Gas masks were issued. Blackouts became routine. Churchill addressed Parliament and the public with language stripped of comfort. He promised suffering. He promised a struggle. He promised no swift conclusion. And the country listened. The moment mattered because it marked the end of a certain Britain, the Britain that believed it could manage threats through balance and diplomacy alone. In its place emerged the Britain defined by resistance, by the willingness to risk everything rather than accept subjugation without a fight. Churchill did not prevent the war from coming to Britain. That was already inevitable. What he prevented was something quieter and more final: the decision to stop resisting before resistance was tested. History would later frame the moment in speeches and slogans, but stripped of myth, it was a simple act, a refusal to ask for terms, a refusal made before the enemy arrived. And once made, it could never be taken back.